Ma'am, once a passport is invalid, there's nothing you can do, Officer Ethan Cole said, his voice flat, controlled, almost bored, as the torn pieces of navy blue paper slipped from his fingers and drifted down onto the polished airport floor like something that no longer mattered. And for a second, nobody moved, not the travelers lined up behind the retractable belts, not the TSA agents standing 2 stations over, not even the man in a gray suit who had been checking his watch every 30 seconds, because the sound of paper tearing had cut sharper than the overhead announcements, sharper than the rolling suitcases, sharper than anything that usually filled Terminal C on a late Thursday afternoon. And Alyssa Carter just stood there, her hand still slightly extended from where she had offered her passport moments ago, her fingers now empty, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold, almost sterile glow across her face, reflecting faintly off the marble tiles beneath her shoes. And if you looked closely, you could see the smallest tremor in her hand, not from fear, not exactly, but from the sudden weight of a moment that had shifted too fast to process. While Ethan leaned back just slightly, adjusting the cuff of his uniform as if nothing unusual had happened, as if tearing a legal document in half was just another routine decision in a long shift that had already stretched past 8 hours, his radio crackling faintly at his shoulder, a distant voice mentioning gate changes and boarding groups, and behind Alyssa, a woman whispered something under her breath, quickly hushed by the man beside her, because no one wanted to be next. No one wanted to step into the invisible line that had just been drawn across that space, dividing authority from everyone else. And Alyssa slowly lowered her hand, her eyes dropping to the scattered pieces of her passport on the floor, each fragment catching the light differently, some face down, some revealing glimpses of official seals and numbers that no longer meant anything in this broken state. And for a moment, the entire airport seemed to shrink into that small square of tile at her feet, the world reduced to the quiet hum of ventilation systems and the distant rumble of a departing plane. And then she bent down, careful, deliberate, as if each movement had to be chosen, her fingertips brushing against the edge of one torn piece, lifting it gently, not rushing, not scrambling, just collecting what was left with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't match the situation at all. And Ethan watched her with a faint crease forming between his brows. Not confusion, not yet, just a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, because she wasn't reacting the way people usually did. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no panic, just silence and motion, steady and controlled. And when she finally straightened back up, holding the pieces together in both hands, she looked at him, not with anger, not with pleading, but with something calmer, something heavier, and she said softly, "Sir, you didn't have to do that," her voice low enough that it almost blended into the background noise, but clear enough that it carried. And for a split second, Ethan felt the weight of the room shift again, like a pressure change you couldn't see but could definitely feel. And he cleared his throat, straightening his posture, his tone sharpening just a fraction as he replied, "Ma'am, you presented an invalid document. I acted accordingly." His words precise, rehearsed, the kind of language that left no room for argument, at least on the surface. And Alyssa nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something deeper than what he had said, her grip tightening slightly around the torn passport pieces, the edges pressing into her skin, leaving faint impressions that would fade in minutes, but somehow felt more permanent in the moment. And somewhere overhead, a boarding call echoed through the terminal. Flight 278 to Washington, D.C. now boarding Group B, the voice cheerful, automated, completely unaware of the stillness below, and a man stepped out of line, trying to maneuver around the scene, his suitcase wheels clicking against the floor, breaking the tension just enough for a few people to shift their weight, to glance away, to pretend this was just another delay, just another inconvenience in a long day of travel. But Alyssa didn't move. She didn't step aside. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood there, her shoulders relaxed but her posture firm, as if rooted in place by something invisible. And Ethan gestured toward the side area with a quick flick of his hand. "You'll need to step over there while we sort this out," his tone carrying the finality of someone used to being obeyed. And she followed the direction without resistance, her steps measured, each one landing softly against the tile, the faint scent of cleaning solution lingering in the air as she moved past the counter. And when she reached the designated area, she turned back slightly, her eyes meeting his again, and there was something in that look, something quiet but unyielding, that made him pause just long enough to notice it, before pushing the feeling aside, because in his world, hesitation was a weakness he couldn't afford. And as Alyssa stood there, holding the remnants of her passport, the hum of the airport slowly returned, conversations resuming in low tones, footsteps continuing their steady rhythm. But beneath it all, something had already shifted, something subtle and irreversible, like a line that had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed, and neither of them fully realized yet just how far that moment was about to reach. The side holding area was colder than the main terminal, the air conditioning humming louder against the narrow glass walls, and Alyssa Carter stood near the metal bench without sitting, her hands still holding the torn pieces of her passport together as if they could somehow be made whole again just by staying aligned, while a digital clock above the door ticked forward in bright red numbers, each second landing with a quiet, mechanical certainty that made the silence feel heavier. And across from her, Officer Ethan Cole typed something into his terminal, his fingers moving quickly, efficiently, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly in his eyes as he pulled up her file, scanning through lines of data that reduced her identity to codes and entries, dates and locations, a history flattened into something impersonal. And every so often, he glanced up, not directly at her face, but just enough to confirm that she was still there, still waiting, still compliant. And that detail seemed to settle something in him, reinforcing the rhythm of control he was used to maintaining, while a second officer leaned casually against the nearby counter, arms folded, observing with mild curiosity but no urgency, as if this were just another routine delay, another passenger who had failed to meet some requirement, another moment that would pass without consequence. And Alyssa shifted her weight slightly, the soft creak of her shoes against the tile barely audible, her gaze moving from the clock to the glass wall, where blurred figures passed by on the other side, their reflections stretching and distorting as they moved, none of them stopping, none of them looking in long enough to understand what had happened. And she inhaled slowly, steadying her breath, the faint scent of coffee drifting in from somewhere down the hall, mixing with the sterile smell of cleaning solution, grounding her in the present even as the situation remained unresolved. And after a long moment, she spoke again, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the stillness. "Officer, I would like to make a call." And Ethan paused for half a second before continuing to type, as if deciding whether the request warranted acknowledgement, then finally responded without looking up. "You can make a call after we verify your information," his tone even, procedural, leaving no room for negotiation. And Alyssa nodded once, though he did not see it, her eyes lowering briefly to the fragments in her hands, the edges slightly bent now from being held too tightly, and she adjusted them carefully, aligning the pieces with a precision that suggested more than just habit, something closer to intention, as if the act itself mattered. And across the room, the second officer shifted his stance, glancing toward Ethan's screen. "Anything unusual?" he asked quietly, and Ethan shook his head once. "Nothing that stands out yet," though his tone carried a faint trace of uncertainty that had not been there before, because something about the situation did not fully match the patterns he was used to, and he could not quite place why. And he leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing as he reread a line on the screen, the name Carter appearing again, tied to multiple entries, addresses that suggested stability, not transience, and a travel history that was consistent, professional. And that detail lingered just a fraction longer than it should have, planting a small seed of doubt that he quickly pushed aside, because doubt was inefficient, and procedure did not leave space for it. And Alyssa watched him now, not openly, but with a quiet awareness, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. And there was something in that stillness that contrasted sharply with the tension in the room, something that did not fit the role he had assigned her in his mind. And the clock ticked forward again, another minute passing, then another, and finally Ethan exhaled softly, reaching for the radio at his shoulder, pressing the button with a quick, practiced motion. "Dispatch, I need a secondary check on a passenger record," he said, his voice steady, controlled, and a crackle answered back, followed by a brief acknowledgement. And as he released the button, he tapped the desk lightly with his fingers, an unconscious rhythm that betrayed a growing impatience, or perhaps something else he had not yet identified. And Alyssa took a small step closer to the counter, not crossing any boundary, just enough to close the distance slightly. And she spoke again, her voice just as calm as before. "I understand you are doing your job, but I really need to make that call." And this time, Ethan looked up directly, meeting her eyes for the first time since the moment at the counter, and what he expected to see was frustration, or fear, or anger, something reactive, something that would confirm the dynamic he was accustomed to. But instead, he found none of that, just a steady gaze that held his for a second longer than necessary. Not challenging, not submissive, just present, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, and he cleared his throat again. Shifting slightly in his chair, "Who are you trying to call?" he asked, the question coming out more pointed than he intended, and Alyssa did not hesitate, her answer simple, direct, "My husband." And the word lingered in the air for a moment, unremarkable on its own, but carrying a weight that had not yet revealed itself, and Ethan nodded once, as if filing the information away without assigning it any particular importance. "Name?" he asked, his fingers already moving back toward the keyboard. And Alyssa adjusted her grip on the torn passport pieces one more time, her voice steady as she replied, "Jonathan Carter." And for a brief second, something in the room shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a change in air pressure before a storm, and Ethan's fingers paused just above the keys, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to matter, before he resumed typing. The sound of the keys filling the silence once more, though now, beneath that steady rhythm, there was something else beginning to surface, something that had not been there before, something that would not stay buried for long. The name settled into the system like a quiet signal that only certain people would recognize, Jonathan Carter. And as Ethan Cole watched the screen refresh, the faint hum of the terminals seemed to grow louder, as if the machine itself understood the weight of what had just been entered, while the cursor blinked once, twice, before a new set of records began to populate, lines of information appearing faster than before, pulling from deeper layers of the database. And Ethan leaned in slightly, his posture tightening without him realizing it, because something about the speed of the response was different, more immediate, more connected than the routine checks he ran dozens of times a day. And across the room, the second officer shifted again, pushing himself off the counter just enough to glance more directly at the screen, curiosity sharpening into attention, while Alyssa Carter remained exactly where she was, her hands still holding the torn pieces of her passport together, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, as if she had already stepped outside the tension of the room and was simply waiting for it to catch up. And the clock above the door ticked forward another minute, the red numbers glowing steadily, indifferent to the shift unfolding below. And Ethan scrolled through the data, his eyes moving quickly now, scanning for inconsistencies, for anything that would confirm his initial judgment. But instead, the details aligned too cleanly: professional credentials, verified addresses, a travel clearance history that suggested not just legitimacy but priority. And he paused for a fraction of a second on one particular line, a designation that did not appear in standard civilian records, something flagged, something that required a higher level of authorization to fully access. And he felt a small, unfamiliar pressure build at the base of his neck, the kind that came when a situation no longer followed the expected script, and he leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, trying to reset the rhythm he was used to, but it did not quite return. And the radio at his shoulder crackled again, a voice from dispatch coming through clearer this time. "Officer Cole, we are confirming identity match on the name you provided. Stand by for additional clearance verification." And the phrasing was subtle, but it was enough to shift the tone of the moment, enough to make the second officer glance at Ethan with a raised eyebrow, a silent question forming between them. And Ethan nodded once, more to himself than anyone else, as if acknowledging that something was unfolding beyond his immediate control, and he tapped the desk again, the rhythm now slightly uneven, betraying a tension he had not yet fully acknowledged. And Alyssa watched him, not with satisfaction, not with vindication, just with a quiet awareness that the moment was changing, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and she spoke again, her voice soft but clear. "May I make that call now?" And this time, the request landed differently, not as a challenge, not as a plea, but as a simple, reasonable step in a situation that was no longer as straightforward as it had first appeared, and Ethan hesitated, just for a second, his eyes flicking back to the screen. Then to her, then back again, and that hesitation, small as it was, did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room, because it broke the pattern he had established from the beginning, and he cleared his throat, reaching for the phone on the desk instead of his radio, pushing it slightly toward her. "Make it quick," he said, his tone still controlled, but missing a fraction of its earlier certainty, and Alyssa stepped forward, closing the distance with measured steps, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk as she set the torn passport pieces down beside the phone, aligning them carefully as if they still held value, and she picked up the receiver, dialing a number from memory, each press of the button deliberate, unhurried, while Ethan watched, his attention now fully fixed on the interaction, as if the act of the call itself might reveal something he had missed, and the line rang once, twice, before connecting, and Alyssa lifted the receiver slightly closer, her voice lowering just enough to create a private space within the public room. "Jonathan, it is me," she said, her tone calm, steady, without urgency, and there was a pause, a voice on the other end responding too softly to be heard, and she continued, "I am at Terminal C. There has been a situation with my passport." Another pause, slightly longer this time, and Ethan felt the shift again, stronger now, like a current running just beneath the surface, and he glanced back at the screen, where new information was still populating, additional flags, additional confirmations, each one layering onto the last, building a picture that was becoming harder to ignore, and Alyssa listened for a moment, then nodded slightly, though the person on the other end could not see it. "Yes, I am fine," she said quietly. "No, I did not raise my voice," and that detail, simple as it was, landed in the room with a weight that none of them expected, because it reframed everything that had happened, not as a confrontation, but as a choice, a decision she had made from the beginning, and Ethan shifted in his chair, the fabric of his uniform tightening slightly across his shoulders as he adjusted his posture, and he realized, not all at once but in pieces, that the control he thought he had was no longer complete, that something larger had entered the situation, something he could not manage with procedure alone, and as Alyssa ended the call, placing the receiver back on the desk with the same care she had used to pick it up, she looked at him again, her expression unchanged, her voice quiet as she said, "He will be here soon," and the words settled into the room like a final piece of a puzzle that had been forming without his permission, and for the first time since the moment the passport had torn, Ethan Cole did not immediately respond, because he no longer knew exactly what to say. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. "He will be here soon." And for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it, the quiet hum of the air conditioning stretching thin against the silence, while Officer Ethan Cole sat there, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, fingers no longer tapping, no longer moving, as if even the smallest motion might disrupt something he did not yet fully understand, and across from him, Alyssa Carter remained. Still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady but not fixed, as though she was simply present in the moment rather than trying to control it. And that contrast, subtle but undeniable, began to settle into the space between them, creating a tension that was not loud, not aggressive, but deeply felt, and the second officer shifted again, this time stepping fully upright, his arms no longer folded, his attention now openly engaged as he glanced from Ethan to the screen and back again, searching for cues that might explain the shift in atmosphere, while the red digits of the clock continued their steady count. Another minute passing, then another, each second layering onto the last with quiet precision, and Ethan finally leaned forward again, his eyes returning to the terminal, scrolling through the expanding record with a slower, more deliberate pace, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that had suddenly become more complex than he had anticipated. And there it was again, the name. Jonathan Carter now. accompanied by additional markers, restricted access flags that flickered briefly before locking behind authorization walls he did not have clearance to bypass. And that alone was enough to tighten something in his chest, because in his experience, names like that did not surface without reason, did not connect to ordinary situations, and he exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together as he adjusted his chair, the faint creak of metal against tile breaking the silence just enough to remind him that this was still happening in real time, still unfolding in front of him, and he reached for his radio again, hesitating for a fraction of a second before pressing the button. "Dispatch, I need status on that verification." His voice controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now, one that suggested urgency rather than routine, and the response came back quicker this time, the static barely masking the shift in tone. "Officer Cole, you are advised to hold position. Supervisory review is in progress." And the phrasing, formal and precise, landed differently than before, enough to draw a brief glance from the second officer, whose expression now held something closer to concern than curiosity, and Ethan released the button slowly, setting the radio down with more care than necessary, his gaze drifting back to Alyssa, who had not moved, had not spoken, her hands now resting lightly on the desk near the torn passport pieces she had aligned so carefully, as if preserving what remained mattered more than reacting to what had been lost. And he studied her for a moment, really studied her this time, noticing the details he had overlooked before, the steadiness in her shoulders, the calm in her breathing, the absence of agitation that would have been expected in a situation like this, and it unsettled him in a way that was difficult to articulate, because it suggested a kind of control that did not come from authority, but from something else entirely, something internal, something he could not regulate or command. And he cleared his throat again, though there was nothing to say, nothing procedural that would fit cleanly into the moment, and the seconds stretched, the clock ticking forward, the distant announcements continuing as if nothing had changed, boarding groups called, flights delayed, lives moving on just beyond the glass wall, while inside this small space, everything felt suspended, waiting for something to arrive. And then it happened, subtle at first, a shift in movement outside the glass, a ripple in the flow of people as someone passed through with a different kind of presence, not loud, not hurried, but noticeable, enough that a few heads turned, enough that the rhythm of footsteps altered slightly, and the second officer glanced toward the hallway, his posture straightening instinctively, while Ethan remained seated, though his attention had already begun to drift in that direction, drawn by something he could not yet see clearly. And Alyssa, for the first time since the call, allowed her gaze to move as well, not sharply, not urgently, just a quiet shift of focus toward the same direction, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady. And in that moment, before anyone spoke, before any introductions were made, the room changed again, the air tightening just enough to signal that whatever came next would not be contained by procedure alone, and Ethan felt it, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a subtle pressure building behind his ribs, a recognition that the situation had moved beyond his control in a way that could not be reversed, and he sat there, waiting, his hands still, his voice silent, as the distance between what he thought he understood and what was actually unfolding continued to close. The movement outside the glass did not rush, it did not demand attention, but it gathered it anyway, like gravity pulling everything subtly toward a center point that had not existed a moment ago. And Officer Ethan Cole felt it before he fully saw it, the way conversations dimmed just slightly, the way a man in a business suit stepped aside without being asked, the way even the rolling wheels of a carry-on suitcase seemed to slow as it passed. And then the figure came into view, tall, composed, dressed in a dark tailored suit that caught the overhead lights without reflecting them, his pace measured, each step deliberate, not hurried, not hesitant, just certain. And for a second, Ethan did not connect the presence to the name that had just echoed through the system, not consciously, but something deeper recognized the alignment, the timing, the quiet authority that did not need to be announced. And beside him, the second officer straightened fully now, his posture shifting from casual observation to alert attention, his eyes tracking the approach with a focus that had not been there before, while Alyssa Carter remained where she was, her gaze lifting slightly as the man drew closer, not with relief, not with urgency, but with a quiet acknowledgement, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before it arrived, and the distance closed steadily, 10 feet, then 5, until the man reached the glass door and paused just long enough for the automatic sensor to trigger. The soft click of the lock releasing sounding louder than it should have in the stillness of the room, and as the door opened, a faint shift in air followed, a subtle change in pressure that seemed to mark the transition from one phase of the moment to another, and Ethan stood then, almost without realizing it, his chair sliding back with a low scrape against the tile, his body responding before his mind fully caught up, and the man stepped inside, his presence filling the space without effort, his eyes moving first to Alyssa, not scanning, not searching, just landing, steady and certain, and for the first time since the situation began, Alyssa's expression softened, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to call it a reaction, but enough to be felt, a slight easing at the corners of her eyes, a subtle release of something she had been holding in place, and the man nodded once, a small gesture, almost private, before his attention shifted to Ethan, and when their eyes met, the room seemed to narrow, the background noise fading just enough to sharpen the focus between them, and Ethan felt it. Immediately, the difference in weight, the shift in balance, the unspoken recognition that whatever authority he had been operating under was no longer the highest in the room, and he cleared his throat, his voice. Steady but lower now, more measured. Sir, this area is restricted. The words coming out of habit more than intention, a reflex to reassert structure in a moment that was slipping beyond it, and the man did not raise his voice, did not step closer, did not make any sudden movement. He simply looked at Ethan for a second longer, his expression calm, composed, but carrying a quiet intensity that did not need volume to be understood. And then he spoke, his tone even, precise, "I am aware," and the simplicity of the response landed with more force than any raised voice could have, because it did not challenge the statement. It absorbed it, redirected it, placed it back into context, and Ethan felt the subtle shift again, the way the ground beneath the interaction had moved, and he glanced briefly toward the terminal, as if seeking confirmation, as if the screen might provide a script to follow. But the information there only reinforced what was already becoming clear, the name, the flags, the restricted access markers, all aligning with the man now standing in front of him. And the second officer took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space, recognizing instinctively that the dynamic had changed, that the boundaries of the moment were being redrawn, and Alyssa stood quietly to the side, her hands resting near the torn passport pieces, her presence no longer contained by the situation but anchoring it, and the man shifted his attention briefly to the desk, his eyes taking in the fragments of the passport, the careful way they had been aligned, the edges still uneven, the official seal broken across multiple pieces, and for a fraction of a second, something passed through his expression, not anger, not shock, but a controlled awareness, a recognition of what had occurred without the need for explanation. And then his gaze returned to Ethan, steady, direct, and in that moment, the room held completely still, the clock continuing its silent count, the air conditioning humming softly, the distant announcements echoing faintly through the walls, all of it continuing as normal, and yet nothing about the moment felt ordinary anymore, because the balance had shifted fully now, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that could not be undone, and Ethan stood there, his posture upright, his hands still at his sides, aware now in a way he had not been before, that whatever came next would not follow the pattern he had relied on. And for the first time since the initial tier of paper against silence, he felt the weight of his own actions settle into place, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, undeniable presence that would not move. For a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because the space between them had already said too much, and Jonathan Carter stood there with the kind of stillness that did not come from hesitation but from control, the kind that made every second feel measured, deliberate, as if even time adjusted itself around him, and his eyes moved once more to Alyssa, briefly, a silent check, a question that did not need to be asked out loud, and she gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, confirming what mattered without turning it into a scene. And that was when he turned back fully to Ethan Cole, his posture unchanged, his voice calm when he spoke. "I would like to understand what happened here." And there was no accusation in the tone, no raised volume, no demand. But the question carried weight, the kind that settled into the room and pressed outward, leaving no space for deflection. And Ethan inhaled slowly, his chest rising just enough to show the effort it took to keep his voice steady. "Sir, the passenger presented a passport that appeared invalid, and I followed protocol." The words coming out in a clean line, practiced, familiar. But even as he said them, something in their structure felt thinner than before, less certain, as if the context around them had changed without permission, and Jonathan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, absorbing the explanation without reaction. And then he stepped closer to the desk, not aggressively, not quickly, just enough to bring himself within arm's reach of the torn passport pieces, and he looked down at them, his eyes taking in the details, the broken seal, the uneven edges, the way they had been carefully aligned despite their damage. And for a brief second, the silence deepened, because the evidence of what had been done was now impossible to ignore, not abstract, not procedural, but physical, present, undeniable. And Jonathan reached out, not to take the pieces, but to rest his fingers lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding himself in the moment. And when he spoke again, his voice was even softer, but somehow carried further. "And your protocol includes destroying a federal document without confirmation." And this time, the words did not land as a question, but as a statement that reframed everything that had been said before, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift from explanation to accountability, the subtle but irreversible movement from control to response. And he opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, his mind searching for the exact phrasing that would re-establish footing, that would bring the situation back into the structure he understood. But the structure was no longer holding, and the second officer looked away briefly, his attention dropping to the floor for a moment, as if even he recognized the weight of the moment settling in. And Alyssa remained where she was, her presence steady, her silence intentional, not withdrawing from the moment, but allowing it to unfold without interference. And Jonathan straightened slightly, his gaze lifting back to Ethan. Did she refuse to cooperate? He asked, and the question was simple, direct, leaving no room for ambiguity. And Ethan shook his head once, almost immediately. "No, sir." And the answer came faster than anything he had said so far, because it was clear, undeniable, and in that clarity, something else began to take shape. And Jonathan nodded once, absorbing the response. "Did she raise her voice?" he continued, his tone unchanged. And again, Ethan answered without hesitation, "No, sir." And the repetition built something in the room, not tension. Exactly, but structure, a sequence that revealed more with each step, and Jonathan's gaze did not waver. Did she attempt to leave or avoid the checkpoint? And this time, Ethan paused for just a fraction of a second, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what it meant. And then he said quietly, "No, sir." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because the pattern was now complete, the facts aligned in a way that did not support the action that had been taken. And Jonathan let that silence sit for a moment, not filling it, not softening it, just allowing it to exist. And then he exhaled slowly, his shoulders remaining relaxed, his posture unchanged. "Then help me understand," he said. And this time, there was something else in his voice, not anger, not frustration, but something deeper, something that asked for more than procedure, something that required reflection. And Ethan felt it settle into him, the realization forming not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual shift, a recognition that the moment had moved beyond what he could justify with routine. And he looked down briefly at the desk, at the torn passport pieces that had started it all, and for the first time, he saw them not as an object in a process, but as the result of a decision, his decision. And when he looked back up, his voice was quieter, less certain. "I made a judgment call," he said, and the words hung there, incomplete, because they did not fully explain what had happened. And Jonathan held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, not in agreement, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, as if marking the point where the truth had begun to surface. And in that moment, the room did not erupt, it did not escalate, It simply shifted again, deeper this time, into something that could not be undone. The words did not disappear after he said them. They stayed in the air. I made a judgment call, settling into the space between them like something that could not be taken back. And Jonathan Carter did not respond immediately. He did not interrupt. He did not correct. He simply let the statement exist, and that silence, measured and deliberate, began to do what no raised voice could have done. It gave the words room to reveal their own weight, and Officer Ethan Cole felt it, not as pressure from the outside, but from within, a slow tightening in his chest as the structure he had relied on continued to shift beneath him. And he stood there, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty, his eyes drifting once more toward the desk where the torn passport pieces rested, no longer just fragments of paper, but evidence of a moment that had unfolded too quickly, too confidently, and without pause. And Jonathan finally moved, not stepping closer, not creating distance, but shifting his weight slightly, enough to signal that the conversation was not over, that it had only just begun to reach its center. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a clarity in it now, something sharper beneath the surface, a judgment call based on what? And the question was simple, but it carried an expectation that could not be avoided. And Ethan inhaled again, slower this time, his gaze lifting to meet Jonathan's, holding it for a second before breaking away, not out of defiance, but because the answer was no longer as easy to shape as it had been moments ago. And he glanced briefly toward the second officer, as if searching for reinforcement, for confirmation that the situation still existed within shared understanding. But the other man remained silent, his expression neutral but distant, offering nothing to hold on to. And Ethan turned back, his voice quieter now, more measured. There were inconsistencies, he said, though even as the words left him, they lacked the strength they once would have carried. And Jonathan tilted his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in examination. What inconsistencies? He asked, and the follow-up came without hesitation, without aggression, just a continuation of the same steady pressure that had been building since he entered the room. And Ethan hesitated, not because he could not recall the moment, but because recalling it now felt different, as if the same actions, when viewed through this lens, no longer aligned with the certainty he had felt before. And he spoke again, slower. The document appeared worn, the edges were not consistent with a recent issue. And as he spoke, his eyes flicked again to the pieces on the desk, and something in that glance betrayed a shift, a recognition that what he had interpreted as a flaw may not have been one at all. And Jonathan followed that glance, his own gaze settling briefly on the passport fragments, then returning to Ethan. So you assumed it was invalid, he said, not asking, but confirming the logic that had led to the decision. And Ethan nodded once, though the movement was smaller than before, less certain. And the room held that exchange quietly, the clock continuing its steady count, the distant sounds of the terminal filtering through the walls, grounding the moment in reality even as it felt suspended. And Alyssa stood just to the side, her presence unchanged, her silence still deliberate. And in that silence, there was no judgment, no visible reaction, just a quiet witness to the unfolding truth. And Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. And instead of verifying, you chose to destroy it. And this time, the statement carried a weight that could not be redirected, because it connected the assumption directly to the action, closing the gap that had allowed the decision to feel justified before. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition. And he did not respond immediately, because there was no clean response left to give, no procedural explanation that could bridge what had already been done. And the second officer shifted again, taking a small step back, creating more space, as if instinctively distancing himself from the center of the moment. And the silence stretched, longer now, deeper. And in that space, something else began to surface, something that had been present from the beginning but had not yet been named. And Ethan felt it, not as a thought, but as a realization forming beneath the surface, something about the speed of his decision, the absence of pause, the certainty that had not been questioned. And he swallowed once, his throat dry, his voice lower when he finally spoke. I believed I was following procedure, he said, and the phrasing shifted again, from certainty to belief, from fact to interpretation, and Jonathan heard it, the subtle change, and he nodded once, acknowledging it without softening. The moment, belief does not replace verification, he said quietly, and the words landed with a finality that did not need emphasis, because they did not attack, they clarified, and Ethan stood there, absorbing it, the weight of the moment settling fully now, not as something external, but as something internal, something that could not be undone or explained away. And for the first time since the beginning, the authority he had relied on felt incomplete, not gone, but insufficient, and the room remained still, not waiting for escalation, but for understanding. And in that stillness, the truth of the moment continued to unfold, one layer at a time, without noise, without spectacle, but with a clarity that would not fade. The words did not echo, they settled. Belief does not replace verification. And for a moment, the room seemed to absorb them without resistance, as if even the walls understood that something fundamental had just been stated. And Officer Ethan Cole stood there, his shoulders still squared, his posture still trained, but the foundation beneath it no longer felt solid, and he became aware of small things he had not noticed before. The faint hum of the overhead lights, the soft vibration of his radio against his shoulder, the slight dryness in his throat that made each breath feel more deliberate than natural. And across from him, Jonathan Carter did not move, did not press forward, did not escalate. He simply remained present, allowing the silence to do what pressure could not. And Alyssa Carter stood beside the desk, her hands resting lightly near the torn pieces, her fingers no longer adjusting them, no longer trying to align what could not be restored in that moment. And yet her stillness did not feel defeated. It felt grounded, as if she had already chosen a position that did not depend on the outcome unfolding in front of her. And the second officer shifted again, this time taking a step further back, his eyes lowering briefly before returning to the scene, as if acknowledging that what was happening no longer belonged to routine observation, and the clock above the door marked another minute, the red digits changing with quiet certainty. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less structure, less certainty, but more truth. "I should have verified before taking action," he said, and the admission did not rise, it did not expand, it simply existed, clear and unembellished. And Jonathan nodded once, not approving, not dismissing, just recognizing the shift, the movement from defense to acknowledgement. And that nod carried its own weight, because it confirmed that the conversation had reached a point where something real had surfaced. And Ethan glanced briefly toward Alyssa, not fully, not directly, but enough to register her presence in a different way than before, no longer as a subject within a process, but as a person who had remained steady through a moment that had not required her to raise her voice. And that realization settled into him slowly, altering the shape of the situation in a way he could not reverse. And Jonathan's gaze followed that glance, briefly resting on Alyssa, then returning to Ethan. "And yet you did not," he said quietly, not as an accusation, but as a continuation of the same line of truth that had been unfolding. And Ethan nodded once, the motion small, restrained, and for a second, he looked down again at the desk, at the passport pieces that now seemed to carry more meaning than their material form, and he reached out, not to fix them, not to move them, but simply to rest his hand on the edge of the desk near them, grounding himself in the reality of what had happened. And the gesture was subtle, almost unconscious, but it marked a shift, a connection between the action and its consequence that had not been fully present before. And the room remained quiet, not tense, not volatile, but heavy with understanding. And Jonathan allowed that understanding to settle before speaking again, his voice steady, controlled. "What happens next matters more than what has already happened." And the statement reframed the moment once more, not erasing the past, but redirecting the focus forward. And Ethan lifted his gaze, meeting Jonathan's eyes again, and this time, there was no attempt to reassert control, no effort to redirect the narrative, just a quiet readiness to respond. And he nodded once, more firmly now. "Yes, sir," he said, and the words carried a different tone than before, not submission, but acknowledgement of the shift that had taken place. And Jonathan turned slightly then, his attention moving toward the door for a brief moment. as if aware of the broader system that existed beyond this room, the layers of authority and process that would inevitably follow. And then he looked back, his gaze steady. "We will address the documentation and ensure that it is corrected," he said, his tone precise, leaving no ambiguity about the next steps. And Ethan nodded again, understanding that the situation had moved beyond his direct control into a space where procedure would be guided by a different level of oversight. And the second officer straightened slightly, as if preparing to re-engage in a more formal capacity. And Alyssa remained still, her presence unchanged, her silence still intentional. And in that silence, there was no demand, no expectation, just a quiet acceptance of the moment as it unfolded. And the clock continued its steady count, the red digits shifting forward once more, marking the passage of time as the situation transitioned from confrontation to resolution, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that would carry forward long after the moment itself had passed. The shift did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, settling into the space like something inevitable. And as Jonathan Carter's words lingered, "What happens next matters more than what has already happened." The room adjusted around that idea, the tension no longer sharp but deeper, more reflective, and Officer Ethan Cole felt it in the way his posture changed without instruction, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the rigid edge of authority softening into something more deliberate, more aware. And he glanced again at the torn passport pieces, no longer seeing them as a problem to process, but as a consequence that could not be undone. And that difference settled into him with a quiet weight, not overwhelming, not sudden, but steady. And Jonathan turned his attention briefly toward Alyssa Carter, his gaze softening in a way that did not diminish his authority, but revealed something beneath it, something personal. And he stepped closer to her, not to shield, not to intervene, but to stand beside her in a way that shifted the dynamic of the room once more, aligning presence rather than asserting control. And Alyssa met his gaze with that same calm she had carried from the beginning, her breathing even, her posture unchanged. And in that moment, there was no need for explanation between them, no need to revisit what had already happened, because the understanding was already there, quiet and complete. And Jonathan's voice, when he spoke to her, carried a different tone now, softer, grounded. "Are you all right?" And the question was simple, direct, without urgency. And Alyssa nodded once, her response just as steady. "Yes, I am." And the exchange was brief, almost private, but it carried a presence that filled the room more than any raised voice could have. And Ethan observed it without meaning to, his attention drawn not to the words but to the way they were spoken, the absence of tension, the absence of reaction. And it unsettled him in a way that felt unfamiliar, because it revealed a kind of strength he had not accounted for when he made his decision. And the second officer shifted again, this time stepping toward the terminal, his hands hovering near the keyboard as if ready to assist, to correct, to move the process forward now that the direction had been clarified. And Ethan noticed the movement, the subtle change in role, and he nodded once, allowing it, recognizing that the situation no longer rested solely in his hands. And Jonathan turned back toward him then, his expression composed, his tone returning to that steady clarity. "We will need to document this properly," he said, not as a suggestion, but as a next step. And Ethan responded immediately, "Yes, sir," the words coming more naturally now, not forced, not defensive, but aligned with the understanding that had taken shape. And Jonathan continued, "And we will ensure that her documentation is restored without delay." And again, there was no raised voice, no emphasis, just a statement of what would happen, and the certainty of it carried more weight than any command. And Ethan nodded again, his gaze steady. Understood. And the exchange, simple as it was, marked a transition, the moment shifting from confrontation into correction, from judgment into responsibility. And Alyssa remained where she was, her hands now resting loosely at her sides, no longer holding the passport pieces, because they had already served their purpose, already revealed what needed to be seen. And she glanced briefly toward the glass wall, watching as the flow of travelers continued beyond it, the movement of people who had no awareness of what had just unfolded. And there was something in that contrast that grounded the moment, reminding her that the world did not stop, that time continued, that moments like this existed quietly within a larger rhythm, and Jonathan followed her gaze for a second, then returned his attention to the room, and Ethan took a step forward, reaching carefully for the torn pieces on the desk, gathering them with more intention than before, aligning them again as best he could, not because it would fix them, but because the act itself mattered now, the acknowledgement embedded in the movement. And he placed them gently into a clear evidence sleeve, his hands steady, his movements deliberate, and as he sealed it, the faint click of the plastic closure echoed softly, marking the transition from what had been done to what would be addressed, and the second officer began entering notes into the system, the quiet tapping of keys filling the space once more, but this time, the sound did not carry tension, it carried direction, and Jonathan watched for a moment, ensuring that the process had begun correctly, then shifted his stance slightly, the subtle movement signaling that his role in the immediate moment was nearing completion, and yet his presence remained, grounding the space, reinforcing the shift that had taken place. And Ethan looked up once more, meeting Jonathan's gaze, and for a brief second, there was no authority in the exchange, no hierarchy, just a recognition, quiet and unspoken, that something had been learned in the space between action and consequence, and the room settled into that understanding, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that would remain long after the moment itself had passed. The quiet did not break, it deepened, settling into the room like a final layer of understanding that no one could step around. And as the system continued to update in the background, lines of documentation forming in neat, structured fields, Officer Ethan Cole stood with a different awareness than before, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each action now carried a weight he could feel rather than ignore. And the evidence sleeve rested on the desk in front of him, the torn passport. Pieces sealed inside, no longer scattered, no longer dismissed, but preserved, acknowledged, and that alone marked a shift he could not overlook. And across from him, Jonathan Carter remained composed, his presence steady but no longer pressing, as if the moment had moved beyond confrontation and into something quieter, something more reflective. And Alyssa Carter stood beside him, her gaze drifting once more toward the glass wall, watching the distant movement of travelers, the rhythm of departure boards updating in silent cycles. And there was something in that contrast that grounded her, something that reminded her that this moment, while significant, existed within a larger world that continued forward without pause. And Jonathan followed her gaze briefly, then returned his attention to the desk, to the process now unfolding with precision. And he spoke again, his voice measured. "What is your next step?" Directing the question not as a challenge, but as a prompt, an expectation that the response would now come from a place of clarity rather than assumption. And Ethan nodded once, his eyes steady as he answered. "We will initiate a formal incident report, document the destruction, and request expedited reissuance through the proper channels." And the phrasing came more carefully now, each word chosen with awareness, not to defend, but to correct. And Jonathan listened, then gave a small nod, acknowledging the direction without embellishment. And the second officer continued typing, his movements efficient, the sound of keys filling the room with a quiet sense of progress. And as the report began to take shape, the moment itself seemed to settle further, no longer suspended, but moving forward with intention. And Ethan reached for a form from the side of the desk, placing it flat, aligning it with the edge as he began to fill in the required details by hand, his pen moving steadily across the paper, each line recorded with care. And there was something in that motion, simple as it was, that marked a deeper shift, the act of writing not just documenting what had happened, but acknowledging it, grounding it in a way that could not be undone or reinterpreted later. And Alyssa watched briefly, not focusing on the words, but on the intent behind them. And she stepped slightly closer to the desk, her presence calm, her voice quiet when she spoke. "Thank you for correcting it." And the statement was not an absolution, not a dismissal, but a recognition of the shift that had taken place. And Ethan paused for a moment, his pen hovering just above the page, before he nodded once. "It is the right thing to do," he said, and the simplicity of the response carried more meaning than anything he had said before, because it was no longer rooted in procedure alone, but in understanding, and Jonathan observed the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged. But there was a subtle easing in his posture, a recognition that the moment had reached a point where correction had replaced conflict, and the clock above the door marked another minute, the red digits shifting forward as the process continued, and the distant announcements echoed faintly through the walls, grounding the scene in the steady rhythm of the airport. And Ethan completed the form, setting the pen down with care before sliding the document toward the second officer for verification, his movements precise, intentional, and the second officer reviewed it quickly, adding a final entry into the system before nodding once, confirming that the process was in motion. And Jonathan stepped back slightly, then, not withdrawing, but allowing space for the procedure to continue without his direct presence, his role now shifting from intervention to oversight. And Alyssa adjusted her stance, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing even, and there was a quiet strength in that stillness, something that had been present from the beginning but now carried a different weight, not as resistance, but as resolution. And Ethan looked up once more, his gaze moving briefly between Alyssa and Jonathan, and there was something unspoken in that glance, not apology, not fully formed, but something closer to recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of what the moment had revealed, and the room held that understanding without needing to define it, the process continuing, the system updating, the next steps unfolding with clarity. And as the evidence sleeve was placed carefully into a secured tray, and the report logged into the system, the moment moved forward, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into something that would carry beyond the room, beyond the terminal, into the quiet space where actions and understanding meet. And the hum of the airport continued, steady and unchanged, as if reminding everyone present that while moments like this may begin in silence, they do not end without leaving something behind. The system confirmation did not make a sound, but it registered all the same, a final line of text appearing on the terminal screen that marked the incident as logged, documented, and moved forward into a process larger than any one person in the room. And Officer Ethan Cole watched it for a second longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on the small, ordinary line that now carried the weight of everything that had happened. And he felt something settle inside him, not relief, not yet, but a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had crossed a point where it could no longer be undone, only understood. And across the desk, the secured tray holding the evidence sleeve sat still, the torn passport pieces inside no longer scattered, no longer dismissed, but preserved as a record of a decision that had unfolded too quickly. And Alyssa Carter stood beside Jonathan, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her presence still, grounded in that same quiet composure that had carried her from the beginning. And there was something in that steadiness that remained difficult to ignore, not because it demanded attention, but because it never tried to. And Jonathan glanced briefly toward the terminal, confirming the status with a single look, then shifted his attention back to Ethan, his voice calm when he spoke. "You will follow up on the reissuance personally." And the statement did not rise, did not carry force, but it left no room for interpretation, and Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes, sir." His response clear, without hesitation, because the expectation now felt aligned with something deeper than instruction. And Jonathan held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod, acknowledging the answer before turning slightly toward Alyssa, his posture easing just enough to reflect the change in focus. And she met his gaze again with that same quiet clarity, and for a second, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added to what had already been understood. And the second officer finished entering the final notes into the system, the soft tapping of keys slowing, then stopping, and he leaned back slightly, his role in the process complete, his attention shifting from action to observation. And the room, once filled with tension, now held something different, something quieter, more reflective, as if the moment itself had settled into a place where it could be seen clearly, without distortion. And Ethan took a small step forward, his movement careful, deliberate, and he looked at Alyssa directly this time, not briefly, not indirectly, but fully. And when he spoke, his voice was steady, but carried a weight it had not held before. "I am sorry for what happened." And the words were simple, unembellished, and they did not try to explain, did not try to justify. They simply existed. And for a moment, the room seemed to pause again, not in tension, but in recognition, because the apology marked something that had not been present at the beginning, something that could not be forced, and Alyssa listened, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and she did not respond immediately. Allowing the words to settle, to exist on their own without rushing to fill the space they created, and then she nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and said quietly, "I appreciate that." And the response did not erase what had happened, it did not soften it, but it acknowledged the shift, the movement from assumption to understanding, and that acknowledgement carried its own quiet strength. And Jonathan observed the exchange without interruption, his expression composed, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight easing that suggested the moment had reached a point where it no longer needed to be held as tightly, and Ethan stepped back slightly, creating space again, his hands resting at his sides, his posture still professional, but now grounded in something more aware, and the clock above the door shifted forward once more, the red digits marking another minute passed, and beyond the glass wall, the flow of travelers continued, uninterrupted, the rhythm of the airport unchanged, and Alyssa glanced toward it again, the movement small, almost instinctive, and Jonathan followed her gaze, then looked back at Ethan. "We will expect an update on the status," he said, his tone steady, and Ethan nodded. "You will have it." And the exchange was brief, precise, and it carried the sense of completion that the moment had been moving toward, and Jonathan turned slightly then, his attention shifting toward the door, signaling that his presence in the room was no longer required in the same way. And Alyssa took a small step with him, her movement aligned, her posture unchanged, and as they reached the doorway, she paused for just a fraction of a second, her eyes moving once more across the room, not searching, not lingering, just acknowledging the space where something had shifted. And then she stepped forward, the door opening quietly, the soft click, marking the transition from inside to outside. And as they moved back into the flow of the terminal, the room behind them remained still for a moment longer, as if holding the echo of what had just occurred, before the normal rhythm resumed. The hum of systems, the quiet movement of staff, the steady progression of time, and Ethan stood there, watching the doorway for a second after it closed, his mind no longer racing, no longer searching for control, but settling into something quieter, something that would stay with him long after the moment itself had passed, not as a disruption, but as a reminder of the space between action and understanding and the responsibility that lived there. The door closed behind them with a soft, almost forgettable click, and the sound lingered just long enough for Ethan Cole to register that the room was different now, not because something had been added, but because something had left, and he stood there for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the space where Alyssa and Jonathan had disappeared into the moving current of the terminal, the steady flow of people outside continuing without pause, as if nothing had happened, as if moments like this dissolved the second they passed through the threshold. But inside the room, the air held onto it a little longer, the quiet heavier, more reflective, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a weight that did not quite lift, and he turned back toward the desk, toward the terminal, toward the evidence tray, each object now carrying a meaning that had not been there before, and the second officer shifted beside him, clearing his throat lightly, not to break the silence, but to acknowledge it. "You handled the follow-up well," he said, his tone neutral, not offering praise, not offering criticism, just stating something that felt necessary to say. And Ethan nodded once, though the words did not settle the way they might have earlier, because he understood now that handling what came after did not erase what had come before, and he reached for the edge of the desk, his fingers resting against the cool surface, grounding himself in the present as his thoughts moved quietly beneath the surface, not racing, not scattered, but steady. And he glanced at the terminal again, at the report he had just filed, the clean lines of text describing the incident in structured language, precise, factual, and he realized how little of the moment those words actually captured, how much of what had happened existed between the lines, in the pauses, in the choices made without hesitation, in the absence of verification that now felt impossible to ignore. And he leaned forward slightly, tapping a few keys to pull up the reissuance request, confirming that it had been marked as expedited, his movements careful, deliberate. as if each action now carried an awareness he could not set aside. And the second officer moved to the side, retrieving a folder, placing it neatly on the desk, aligning it with the others, restoring order to the space in a way that felt almost instinctive. And Ethan watched the motion for a second, recognizing the familiarity of it, the routine that usually defined their work, and yet it felt different now, because the routine no longer existed in isolation. It carried context, it carried consequence, and he straightened, his posture still professional, but no longer rigid. And he picked up the evidence sleeve from the secured tray, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, the torn passport pieces visible through the clear plastic, their edges uneven, their alignment imperfect despite the care taken to preserve them. And he studied them, not analytically, not as part of a process, but as a reminder, something tangible that connected action to outcome. And then he placed the sleeve back into the tray with care, closing it firmly. The soft click of the latch echoing quietly in the room, and the second officer glanced at him briefly, then looked away, giving him space without making it obvious, and the clock above the door marked another minute, the red digits shifting forward with steady precision, and Ethan reached for his radio, pressing the button with a more measured motion than before. Dispatch, this is Officer Cole. Incident has been logged and reissuance request submitted. I will follow up personally. His voice steady, clear. And the response came back quickly, acknowledging the update, the routine continuing, the system moving forward. And he released the button, lowering the radio back to his shoulder. And for a moment, he stood there in the quiet, not waiting for the next instruction, not rushing into the next task, just allowing the moment to settle fully. And his gaze drifted once more toward the glass wall, toward the movement beyond it. And he saw something he had not noticed before, not a specific person, not a single detail, but the way people moved through the space, each carrying their own purpose, their own direction, their own story that was not immediately visible. And he realized how easily those stories could be reduced, misread, acted upon without pause, and that realization did not arrive as a sudden realization, but as a quiet shift, something that would remain with him beyond this moment, shaping the way he saw what came next. And he turned back toward the desk, the terminal, the routine waiting to resume. And as he reached for the next file, his movements remained steady, but there was something different beneath them now, something quieter, more aware, something that could not be undone. And the room, once again, returned to its rhythm, the hum of systems, the soft movement of staff, the steady progression of time. But within that rhythm, something had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that would carry forward, shaping the space between action and understanding with a clarity that would not fade. The terminal lights flickered almost imperceptibly as another boarding call echoed through the airport, a calm voice announcing departures that continued without hesitation. And inside the small checkpoint room, Officer Ethan Cole stood in the same place, but not as the same man who had stood there before, his hands resting lightly on the desk, his posture still upright, still disciplined, yet carrying something quieter beneath it now, something that had settled in after the moment passed but refused to leave. And the hum of the system around him returned fully, screens updating, radios crackling softly, footsteps passing beyond the glass, everything moving forward with the steady rhythm of routine. And yet the space between those movements felt different, as if something invisible had shifted its weight. And Ethan glanced once more at the secured tray, the evidence sleeve still resting inside. The torn passport pieces preserved not just as documentation, but as a reminder that could not be rewritten. And he exhaled slowly, not heavily, not dramatically, just enough to release the tension that had been sitting quietly beneath his ribs. And the second officer moved past him, returning to his station, picking up another file, another routine task, the kind that usually blended into the day without distinction. And Ethan reached for his own terminal again, pulling up the next record, the screen glowing softly in front of him. But this time, he did not move immediately, his fingers hovering just above the keyboard as his eyes scanned the information with a different kind of attention, not faster, not slower, but deeper, as if each line carried more than just data, more than just verification points. And for a moment, the sound of the airport filtered through the walls, a rolling suitcase passing, a distant laugh, the quiet murmur of conversations overlapping, and he realized how easily those sounds had once faded into the background.